Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving into a pivotal moment in history, the sinking of the RMS Lusitania.
Yeah.
Now, you probably know the basics. A British passenger liner sunk by a German U-boat in 1915.
Yay.
But was it simply a tragic accident, an unavoidable act of war, or perhaps a calculated gamble gone wrong? That's what we're here to explore.
It's a question that has haunted historians for over a century, and to unpack it, we have to understand the context. 1915, the world engulfed in the First World War, the U.S. desperately trying to maintain neutrality.
Right.
The Lusitania, a symbol of luxury and technological advancement, set sail from New York to Liverpool, carrying over 1,900 passengers and crew.
I find it fascinating that at the time the Lusitania was seen as a symbol of safety and speed. But lurking beneath the surface of this seemingly routine voyage was a dangerous undercurrent of wartime tensions.
Absolutely. Germany had declared unrestricted submarine warfare, meaning any vessel, even passenger ships, could be targeted in the war zone. And they made no secret of it. In fact, the German embassy issued warnings in New York newspapers, specifically cautioning Americans about the risks of traveling on British ships.
It's almost unbelievable that those warnings were published right alongside advertisements for the Lusitania itself.
I'm curious, what do you think this tells us about the media landscape and the public's understanding of the risks involved?
It's a powerful illustration of the complexities of information dissemination during wartime. Did people simply not grasp the gravity of the situation? Were they swayed by a false sense of security, or were they deliberately misled? These are questions that continue to intrigue historians.
It makes you wonder if those passengers truly understood they were sailing into a war zone, especially considering the speed with which the tragedy unfolded on May 7th, 1915, just off the coast of Ireland. A German U-boat fired a torpedo, striking the Lusitania's starboard side. The ship sank in less than 20 minutes.
The speed of the sinking is truly staggering. It left little time for organized evacuation, resulting in a chaotic and terrifying scene.
Oh my goodness. Over 1,100 people lost their lives, including over 120 Americans.
I can only imagine the sheer panic and terror as the ship went down. And it's hard to ignore the parallels to modern-day maritime disasters, reminding us of the inherent vulnerability of life at sea. But what I find particularly intriguing is the role of the British Admiralty. Our sources indicate they had advised the Lusitania's captain to take evasive actions, things like zigzagging, to make it a more difficult target.
Yes, but for reasons that remain unclear, he largely ignored these recommendations. Now, was this due to overconfidence, a belief in the Lusitania's speed, or were there other factors at play? And this is where things start to get really murky.
And the waters get even murkier when we consider the Lusitania's cargo. It turns out that beneath the decks, hidden amongst the luggage and personal belongings, was a secret stash of war munitions destined for Britain.
This revelation, which came out after the sinking, is a game changer. It provided Germany with a powerful argument. The Lusitania, despite its passenger status, was a legitimate military target.
So how did this information impact the public's perception of the tragedy? Did it shift the narrative from a horrific act of aggression to something more ambiguous?
It certainly added a layer of complexity to the story. Suddenly, it wasn't just a case of an innocent passenger liner being attacked. The presence of munitions raised uncomfortable questions about the blurred lines between civilian and military targets and the risks associated with neutrality in wartime.
It also raises questions about the British Admiralty's role. Did they knowingly put civilian lives at risk by transporting munitions on a passenger liner? And did this knowledge influence the captain's decision to disregard the evasive maneuvers?
These are the very questions that fuel the debate about whether the sinking of the Lusitania was a tragic accident, an act of war, or something far more calculated.
We've been unraveling the events surrounding the Lusitania, and it's clear that the presence of those munitions on board cast a long shadow over the entire incident. But how did the world react to this revelation? What were the immediate consequences?
Well, the sinking of the Lusitania sparked international outrage, particularly in the United States. President Woodrow Wilson demanded an apology and reparations from Germany and called for an end to unrestricted submarine warfare.
So even though the Lusitania was carrying war materials, the attack on a passenger ship carrying civilians, including Americans, was still seen as a major breach of international norms.
Precisely, there was a sense that Germany had crossed a line, and the incident significantly damaged their international reputation. Initially, Germany tried to appease the U.S., issuing an apology and promising to restrict submarine attacks on passenger vessels.
It sounds like they were trying to de-escalate the situation and avoid drawing the U.S. further into the conflict. Did it work?
Not in the long run. The reality was that Germany was in a desperate struggle for survival, facing a crippling blockade by the Allied forces. They felt compelled to use every weapon in their arsenal, including their U-boats.
So this Allied blockade you mentioned, could you explain what that entailed and how it impacted Germany's strategic decisions?
Essentially, the Allied powers, primarily Britain and France, had established a naval blockade to cut off Germany's access to vital supplies and resources. This blockade severely hampered their war effort and put immense pressure on their economy and their ability to sustain the conflict.
Ah, so Germany felt backed into a corner. Their unrestricted submarine warfare was a gamble, a desperate attempt to break the stalemate in the Atlantic and counter the Allied blockade.
It was a high-stakes gamble, and one that ultimately backfired despite some initial successes. The sinking of the Lusitania and other neutral ships further inflamed public opinion against Germany, especially in the U.S.
It's that poking the bear analogy again, isn't it? Each attack on a neutral vessel pushed the U.S. closer to abandoning its neutrality?
Exactly, and the tension kept ratcheting up in February 1917. A German U-boat sank the Lusitania, an American merchant ship, without warning. This incident, coming after repeated warnings and broken promises, was the final straw.
This attack on the Lusitania seems like a pivotal moment. Did it immediately lead to the U.S. entering the war?
It was the catalyst, the tipping point. President Wilson, who had been trying to keep the U.S. out of the war, now saw no other option. He addressed Congress, delivering a powerful speech denouncing Germany's actions and calling for a declaration of war.
His speech is quite famous, isn't it? What were some of the key arguments he used to persuade Congress and the American public?
Wilson framed the war as a battle between democracy and tyranny, a fight for freedom and the rights of all nations. He argued that Germany's aggressive actions threatened the very foundations of international order, and that the U.S. had a moral obligation to defend these principles.
So the sinking of the Lusitania, while not the sole cause, was a significant factor in the U.S.'s decision to join the war. It set off a chain of events that shifted global alliances and ultimately altered the course of the conflict.
It's crucial to understand that the U.S. entry into the war had a profound impact. Their resources, manpower, and industrial might tipped the scales in favor of the Allies and played a decisive role in Germany's eventual defeat.
We've been dissecting the events and consequences. But let's return to that central question that's been guiding our deep dive. Was the sinking of the Lusitania an unfortunate accident, a justifiable act of war, or a calculated gamble that spun out of control?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And as we've explored, the answer is complex and multifaceted. There's evidence to support each perspective. Germany argued that the Lusitania carrying war materials was a legitimate military target, especially in the context of unrestricted submarine warfare.
That's a valid point, but even if it was a legitimate target, did they have to sink it without warning, causing such a massive loss of civilian life? Wouldn't that be considered a violation of international law even back then?
You're raising an essential point. Even during wartime, there were established conventions, rules of engagement that aimed to minimize civilian casualties. The sinking of the Lusitania, particularly the lack of warning and the speed with which it sank, raised serious questions about the proportionality and legality of the attack.
So even if we accept the argument that the Lusitania was a legitimate military target, the manner in which the attack was carried out is still highly controversial and open to debate.
Precisely. And then there's the even more unsettling question. Did Germany deliberately provoke the U.S., knowing that sinking the Lusitania with American citizens on board might lead to their involvement in the war?
That's a chilling thought. Were they willing to risk a wider conflict to achieve their strategic objectives? Was it a calculated gamble that ultimately backfired?
It's a question that historians continue to grapple with. There's no smoking gun, no definitive proof of intent, but the evidence suggests that German leadership was aware of the risks involved and chose to proceed anyway. Whether this constituted a deliberate provocation or a reckless miscalculation is a matter of debate.
It seems like we're dealing with a tangled web of motivations, justifications, and unintended consequences. The sinking of the Lusitania wasn't a simple event with a clear-cut explanation. It was a tragedy that exposed the complexities of warfare, the fragile nature of neutrality, and the high stakes of international diplomacy.
Absolutely. And while we may never definitively answer the question of intent, the Lusitania remains a powerful reminder of the devastating consequences of conflict, the human cost of war, and the enduring importance of seeking peaceful resolutions to international disputes.
We've been examining the sinking of the Lusitania from multiple angles, exploring the political and military ramifications of this pivotal event. But in the midst of these grand historical narratives, it's easy to lose sight of the human dimension. the individual stories of those whose lives were forever changed on that fateful day.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's crucial to remember that the Lusitania wasn't just a ship. It was carrying over 1,900 souls, each with their own dreams, aspirations, and loved ones.
Our sources paint a vivid picture of the passengers and crew, a microcosm of society. At the time, there were wealthy socialites, families immigrating to new lands, artists, writers, businessmen, and ordinary people seeking a better life.
And within those 1,100 souls lost, we find stories of incredible courage, selflessness, and the enduring strength of the human spirit, even in the face of unimaginable tragedy.
One story that stands out is that of Alfred Gwynne Vanderbilt, an American businessman and heir to a railroad fortune. He was traveling on the Lusitania with his valet, and despite his wealth and privilege, he could have easily secured a lifeboat for himself.
Yet eyewitness accounts describe Vanderbilt calmly assisting others, giving up his own life jacket to a young mother, and helping women and children into lifeboats.
It's a remarkable testament to his character, choosing to help others in a moment of such chaos and terror. Sadly, like so many others, Vanderbilt perished in the sinking, and his body was never recovered.
His story and countless others like it remind us that even amidst such tragedy, humanity can shine through. The sinking of the Lusitania wasn't just a historical event. It was a deeply personal tragedy for thousands of families across the globe.
And as we conclude our deep dive, I think it's important to reflect on what we can learn from this event. The Lusitania serves as a stark warning about the fragility of peace, the devastating consequences of conflict, and the enduring importance of diplomacy and international cooperation.
It also highlights the importance of critical thinking and media literacy, as we discussed earlier. The German embassy issued warnings, but were they truly understood? Were people adequately informed of the risks? It reminds us to question the information we receive, to seek out multiple perspectives, and to be discerning consumers of news, especially in times of heightened tension.
Those are powerful lessons, and ones that resonate deeply in our current world, where information flows so rapidly and the potential for conflict is ever present. So as we remember the Lusitania and those who lost their lives, let's also remember the lessons it offers us about the importance of peace, understanding, and informed engagement with the world around us.
Well said. The Lusitania may be a century-old tragedy, but its legacy lives on, reminding us that the pursuit of a more peaceful and just world is an ongoing journey that demands our constant attention and commitment.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Lusitania. We hope you've gained new insights and perhaps been moved by the stories we've shared.
It was a pleasure exploring this complex and fascinating event with you.
Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep diving deep.